The story began in the vicinity of the Eggrite Empire in a local forest. It was there, amid the cawing of crows, that a frightened little girl was running. The daughter of Duke Croft ran as fast as she could through the trees, looking back, but she did not know where she was. Elia began to call out to her father, but when she heard no answer, she cried even harder and began to scold herself for being silly and letting go of her father's hand and falling behind him. Suddenly, a frog croaked from behind the bushes and jumped right at the girl, who immediately became frightened and covered herself with her hands. When the animal disappeared, the girl fell helplessly to the ground, still crying, but she had no strength left to get up. Hearing her voice, an unfamiliar boy came to her. He reached out his hand to help her up. Ellie did not immediately respond to his outstretched hand and was about to cry again, but the boy hurried her along and she finally accepted his help. Raymond took her to his house and on the way asked her how she had managed to get lost in the forest. The girl replied that her father worked in the palace administration and she just wanted to see where he worked. The girl also said that she had not managed to follow her father, so she got lost and said that the forest was scary. The boy assured her that it was not so, and that next time he would show her the beautiful places in it. At first the girl looked at him enchanted and thought that perhaps that was the moment when it all began, because Raymond had captured her heart. Years passed. The girl returned to her duchy and continued to grow up there. Elia secretly watched her father while the maids helped him get dressed. The girl noticed that the maids were behaving more politely toward her father than usual. She distracted her father and asked if he was going to the imperial palace. The Duke shook his head sadly, knowing that his daughter always asked to go to the palace whenever she had the chance, and warned her that it was no place for fun. The girl looked away guiltily. After that, she began to cry, saying that in that case she would be left alone in this huge palace. The Duke took pity on his daughter, and the girl knew that this would have an effect on her father, because he had lost his wife early and therefore cared deeply for his daughter. Turning around, the man finally gave in and told his daughter to get ready quickly because there was little time. Thus, the walls of the Ygritte palace became familiar to the girl, and she was able to meet Raymond more often. One clear day they agreed to meet, but it was already evening and he did not come. So she decided to look for him herself. But no matter where she looked or who she asked, the boy was nowhere to be found and no one knew where he was. It was already evening, but she still couldn't find the boy. Suddenly, she noticed a strange building towering on a hill. She began to climb the stairs, and before her appeared a building that looked like some kind of pavilion. The girl quickly realized that it must be an abandoned palace and was sure that Raymond couldn't be there. But suddenly she heard someone shouting angrily. Hiding behind a tree, Elia finally saw the boy, but someone was yelling at him and then hit him in the face. The stranger told Raymond to keep living as if he didn't exist and not to disgrace the imperial family again. Watching this horrific scene, the girl began to tremble with fear and silently begged the boy to run away. The girl knew well who was standing over her friend, because once, when she was even younger, her father had introduced her to Crown Prince Asta Ygritte. When the Crown Prince finally left, Raymond gathered his last strength, got up and headed toward the palace, but hearing someone crying, he went to the tree where he saw Ellie. The girl immediately threw herself into his arms, and the boy, in turn, smiled and tried to calm her down, assuring her that everything was fine. In her friend's embrace, the girl could only think how sorry she felt for him, because he didn't even have the right to shed a tear. But she was still so young that she didn't understand her feelings. A few years later, the lady's maid noticed that the girl was dressed too lightly and might freeze, but Ellie replied with a smile that if she wore something warmer, she wouldn't be able to show off her dress. The maid gave up and the girl went outside, but as the maid had warned, it was already too cold outside. Shivering from the fierce wind, the lady thought she should have listened to the maid. When she finally met her friend, the girl began to twirl around him and said without hiding that it was her new dress. Raymond made no comment about it, but instead told her the news he had been wanting to tell her for a long time. The boy told her that he had met a girl whom he liked very much. This made her heart ache so much that she began to feel pain, but the only thing she could do at that moment was to smile happily. Even though her heart was beating painfully in her chest, she only smiled in response to his news because she wanted him to be happy. From that day on, whenever they met, the boy talked only about that girl, but it hurt her to listen, especially when she saw Ray so happy. She didn't want to hear about it anymore. but she understood that she couldn't confess her feelings to the boy when he had finally found happiness. In her duchy, the girl could not find peace, and even new dresses no longer brought her happiness, because she understood that there was no one left to wear them for. The worried maid told the lady not to choose just anything, but something she really liked, because the next ball was not just any ball, but a ball announcing the arrival of spring. However, while at the ball, the girl was still indifferent to what was happening around her. She was not interested in dancing or talking to her peers. Suddenly, she heard the other guests turn their attention to a couple, and Ellie also looked up at them. A crowd gathered to watch Raymond dance with another lady. Everyone was praising the couple, saying how well they suited each other. The girl looked at her friend's chosen one. She already knew that it was a lady from the family of the Marquis of Sios, Regina. Holding her gaze on the couple for a moment longer, the girl noticed how they suddenly began to laugh cheerfully, and their sincere laughter struck her even more. That was enough for her. Clenching her hand, she quickly turned away and decided that her feelings had to end there. Returning to the duchy after the ball, the girl was getting ready for bed, but she couldn't get what she had seen out of her head. Suddenly, there was a knock at the door, and the maid announced that a guest had arrived for the lady. The girl was quite surprised that someone had come to see her at such a late hour, but she quickly got dressed and went to meet her guest. Descending the stairs, she finally saw Raymond. He was waiting for her on the couch but could barely speak because he was drunk. The girl immediately rushed to him. She began to ask what had happened and why he was in such a state. Barely able to speak, the boy confessed that Regina was marrying the old ruler of the Western Kingdom. The boy felt miserable because he couldn't protect his beloved from this, but Elia assured him that he wasn't miserable. A moment later, tea was brought to the room. After a short silence, the girl assured her friend that she would always be there for him and that everything would work out in time. After Regina left for the Western Kingdom, the girl constantly visited Raymond. However, since then, the smile had disappeared from her friend's face. Seeing this, the girl did not have the strength to give him her small gift. Nevertheless, she hoped that if she kept trying, one day he would smile. However, 2 years later, the girl dropped her cup and stood up in shock at what she heard. On that day, the Duke informed his daughter that at one of the parties, Raymond's mother had accidentally spilled a drink on the Crown Prince, and it had ended badly. However, the girl could not even imagine that such a minor offence would result in the death penalty for the woman. The boy's mother, who had been constantly oppressed because of her origins, was not even given a funeral ceremony. After that, the girl immediately rushed to the boy's estate and found him leaning over a blood-stained cloth. The boy was extremely distraught over his mother's death. Cries of anguish tore from his throat. Ellie was in great pain watching her friend suffer. He had been bullied and beaten all his life, and now his beloved girlfriend had left him. Even so, the young man had not shed a tear, but now, holding the piece of cloth left by his mother, he could not stop crying. The girl quietly approached and sat down next to him. They sat there until almost nightfall. When the boy's emotions had calmed down a little, he stood up and told Ellie that from now on he would not allow himself to lose the one who was dear to him. A year later, after he had said those words, Raymond staged a coup. The emperor was constantly indulging himself and stopped ruling the country properly, and the crown prince turned out to be incompetent. Because of this, it was not difficult to gather loyal people who wanted to change the situation, and her father was the first to support Raymond. That is how all the power ended up in the hands of the young man. It was at this moment that the young man who had staged a coup in the imperial palace became emperor himself. After all these events, one day the duke summoned his daughter for a conversation, but the words would not come out of his mouth. However, finally gathering all his strength, he told Ellie that the emperor had asked her to marry him. The girl was overwhelmed with happiness because even though she would become empress, that was not the most important thing for her, because from now on, Raymond, whom she had always loved deeply, would be her husband. At the ceremony, the young man turned to her and said that he had always seen how lonely his mother was, so he promised that he would never fill the palace with beautiful women. Although he could not promise her his love, he could say with certainty that he would never bring another woman into this house. She closed her eyes for a moment. She understood that although he had not promised her love, the fact that she would be the only woman by his side was enough for her. Elia was sure that if she loved him more, their future would be happy. Years passed in this marriage, and one day the doctor informed the Empress that she was expecting a child. Her Majesty was extremely happy that she and her beloved would finally have a child. She almost rushed out to tell the Emperor the news. Overcome with joy, she immediately ran to the Emperor's palace. She had already lost a child once, and the doctor said that it would be difficult to get pregnant again, which made her husband even more distant. She did not blame him for this, and believed that it was because he really wanted children. The maid asked her to be more careful and not to run, but the woman simply could not restrain herself. The Empress was sure that His Majesty would be delighted to hear her news. Approaching the door of the study, she told the servants to announce her arrival. However, before she could even touch the door handle, she heard that Lady Regina was returning to the Empire. This news stunned Ellie. The maid immediately noticed the lady's concern and asked if she should inform the Emperor of her arrival. Looking away, the Empress said that it would be better not to tell the Emperor that she had come. Clenching her hand, the woman turned and walked away. Returning to her chambers, the woman looked somewhere as if into the void, with deep disappointment. The maid asked if everything was all right with the lady. The woman asked if the maid had also heard everything and if perhaps she had simply made a mistake. But Helen quickly bowed her head, indicating that everything she had heard was true. She said that she was very sorry and asked the lady for forgiveness, but the Empress assured her that it was not her fault and only asked that the maid leave her alone. Left alone, the woman kept wondering why Regina had suddenly returned. She hadn't even become queen but had spent 7 years as a concubine. The Empress knew that the girl would not have been able to return before the king's death, so she couldn't understand how she had managed to get back. The woman was sure that as soon as her rival returned, she would be with the Emperor again. And although she knew that after Regina's departure, Ray had married her, she did not know his love. Elia couldn't help thinking that as soon as her husband's former lover returned, their feelings would be as warm as ever. Suddenly, negative thoughts echoed in her stomach, and the woman instantly remembered the doctor's words that she should be careful and not overexert herself. The woman stopped, and with tears in her eyes began to apologize to the child for forgetting about her, but promised that it would never happen again. Evening was slowly approaching, and one of the maids came to the Empress to inform her that it was time for dinner with her husband. Quickly gathering herself, the woman came to the room where the Emperor was already waiting for her. Elia noticed her husband's distant gaze and was sure that he was thinking about Regina. The Empress was somewhat offended by this and wondered if there had ever been a moment when the Emperor had thought of her. A moment later, to break the silence, the Empress apologized for being late, but the Emperor replied that it was not worth it, as he himself had arrived too early, and then ordered all the servants to leave. When the room was empty, the Emperor decided to have a little chat. He said that he had heard that the Empress had visited her father today. The woman continued to eat sadly. She understood that all this talk was just banal curiosity about how her day had gone. His wife confirmed this, but the Emperor hardly reacted. The Empress already knew that their conversations were now filled with such topics. However, she herself left the palace without even her servants, and it upset her that her husband did not even care. She wondered if her husband would be as indifferent if she were Regina. And although she knew it was wrong to think that, as soon as she heard that name again, her soul became restless. The woman wanted to tell him the news, but looking at her husband, she could see from his expression that he was too wary. She had lived with him long enough to understand everything just by looking at his face, and she was sure that it all had to do with his former love. She almost wanted to cry. Holding back her emotions, the woman finally decided to ask her husband if Regina was really returning to the Empire. Raymond was a little alarmed. When he asked her how she knew, she replied that she had been passing by his office and overheard him. The Emperor confirmed this and said that she would return in a couple of days. The Empress became nervous again, but asked how she could return if she was a concubine. The Emperor replied that about 2 weeks ago the King of the Western Kingdom had died of an illness, and the throne had passed to his heir. He also said that the concubines who had not slept with the previous king had been sent home, so Regina had regained her name and would now become Lady Seos. The woman was saddened by what she heard, because she understood that if her rival returned as a former concubine, she would not be able to contact Raymond. The Emperor noticed his wife's concern and immediately told her that she should not worry about it. The woman was somewhat stunned by what she heard. The Empress could not understand what his words meant, and the emperor reminded her of his promise, which he did not intend to break. Elia did not forget this, but she was also concerned about what he would have done if he had not promised her that then. The emperor assured her that he had no intention of stirring up unnecessary rumors in the palace because of his other relationships, and assured her that she was the only empress in his heart. After that, he bowed his head again and sank into his thoughts. The woman noticed this, of course, but forced herself to smile at his answer. The next day, the empress continued to drift in her thoughts, ignoring the servants who were calling her loudly. Finally, one of them managed to attract the lady's attention. The empress looked at her maids, realizing that she had often been lost in her thoughts, which was why the servants looked at her with pity. The woman felt sad that even as empress, her maids looked at her with pity, and if things continued this way, they would look at her child the same way. The woman realized that she had to pull herself together, so she quickly got up and said that she wanted to wear something luxurious today, because she hadn't been out with her husband in a long time. Elia, of course, understood that accompanying the emperor was very important, but the event they were going to was a banquet in honor of Regina's return. At dinner the previous evening, the woman had asked if the emperor really needed to attend the ball. Her husband replied that as head of state he did not need to, but as Raymond, he did. The empress was shocked by his answer. A moment later, her husband continued and said that his former lover had gone to the Western Kingdom only because of him. He went on to say that since he had caused so much trouble for the lady, he wanted to do at least the least he could out of courtesy. Elia knew that Regina had actually gone to the Western Kingdom on the orders of the Crown Prince. It was all for the sake of announcing an alliance between the Empire and the kingdom. However, rumours began to spread among the nobility that the girl had refused to marry the Crown Prince and had begun to see Raymond, which was why she had been sent to that kingdom. However, there were also other rumours. At that time, a severe fire broke out in the Marquis of Cios's estates, and finances became very tight, so Regina volunteered to go to help. Because of this, the Empress herself was convinced until today that her rival had chosen the path of a concubine of the kingdom and that her husband thought she had left because of him. After that, Ray said that his ex-wife had already suffered enough because of him and various rumours, so he wanted to attend the banquet purely to say hello. The Empress understood that he could not be persuaded. However, she wondered if her husband would have acted the same way if he had given even the slightest thought to the rumours that would circulate about her after attending this banquet. The woman was hurt that she did not receive even the slightest bit of care from her husband, which is why she had to go with him to the banquet today to protect her honour, which the Emperor had no intention of defending. After that, the Empress smiled reproachfully because she understood that if Regina had not gone to that kingdom at that time, she would have been in her place. In a moment, the woman realized that she was very nervous again and that this could harm the child. Calming down, she was haunted by the thought of when would be the best time to tell her husband about the pregnancy. She understood that Ray's thoughts were now only about his ex, so she did not want her child to be less important than her rival. The Empress thought that perhaps the best option would be to tell him after the banquet, because when the Emperor saw his ex, his sadness would dissipate a little. However, she also understood that after that, his attention to her would diminish even more, and she had not yet told him the news about the child. A maid brought a gold-embroidered dress, and the Empress remembered that her husband had given her this dress for her birthday. It was made in the best salon in the Empire, the only one in the world. This dress meant a lot to her, but in the days following her birthday celebration, she lost her child, so she had no opportunity to wear it. She wondered if Raymond himself remembered this dress. Nevertheless, she decided to wear it. The maids were delighted that their mistress was finally smiling again, so they hurried to help her get ready for the banquet. After a while, the maids looked at their work and informed the lady that she was completely ready. The girls couldn't take their eyes off the Empress and praised her beauty. They assured her that when the Emperor saw her, he would be amazed by her beauty. The woman smiled and thanked everyone for their work. One of the maids assured her that everything would be just as they said, because the Emperor was the one who had given the dress to his wife. The Empress smiled again, and the maid said that it was time to go down so as not to keep His Majesty waiting. As the woman descended the stairs, the Emperor was already waiting. The woman called out to the Emperor, and he turned and looked at her. The Empress was struck by how handsome His Majesty looked in this outfit. Approaching him, she carefully averted her gaze. She wondered if her husband remembered the dress she was wearing. However, the emperor did not say a word about her appearance, but only said that the party had probably already started and they were late. He held out his hand to her, but the woman did not immediately respond because she was shocked that her husband had completely ignored her efforts. Elia thought that she had never expected anything from her husband before, so she did not understand why she was waiting for something now. Looking at him, she noticed his eternally indifferent gaze, which contained neither hatred nor love. She just wanted Raymond to notice her once. At this thought, the woman's head bowed, and the emperor, noticing this, asked if everything was all right. The empress smiled and assured him that everything was fine. With that, they left for the marquis's estate, where the rest of the guests had already gathered. One of the servants announced the arrival of their majesties the emperor and empress, and all the guests immediately stopped what they were doing and looked toward the entrance. As the emperor and empress walked into the hall, all the guests bowed their heads in anticipation. A moment later, the emperor gave everyone permission to rise. Elia, in turn, looked around at the guests and immediately saw Regina. Ray looked at his former lover with a look full of regret and sadness, and she looked back at him with an equally sad look. They had parted when their love was at its strongest. Now, after 7 years of separation, they met again. The woman did not even want to imagine what they were feeling at that moment, and turned away so as not to look at them. Lady Sios spoke, and thanked the emperor and empress for attending the banquet in honor of her return. Elia noticed her rival's smile. It was the same smile she had smiled before she was sent away. The woman did not understand how Regina could smile the same way she did then. The empress also noticed that all the guests were looking at the lady with pity. The woman, in turn, felt like the main villain in this situation, and also felt the guests' glances. But they were completely different. Raymond sincerely welcomed Lady Sios back and wished her good health without any emotion. The lady smiled and immediately thanked him. The empress understood that, after her husband had spoken, she should also say something. The woman wanted to say something. But suddenly it felt as if someone had deliberately squeezed her throat and she couldn't get the words out. The emperor noticed that something was wrong with his wife, and a look of concern flashed across his face. But the woman quickly pulled herself together and smiled, assuring him that everything was fine. Finally, she dared to wish Regina happiness and to forget her past life so that she could live here again. Lady Sios was initially very surprised and seemed to become nervous, but she quickly bowed and thanked the empress for her greetings. After that, the emperor said that they had come only to greet the lady and wanted to return, because if they stayed too long, they might attract unnecessary attention. The empress saw the looks the former lovers were giving each other, but assured herself that she only had to endure a little longer, and it would all be over when they returned to the palace. At that, the emperor wanted to take his wife by the hand and leave the banquet, but Regina stopped them, which shocked the empress. Raymond noticed his wife's reaction, but still allowed Lady Sios to say what she wanted. A moment later, an elderly man entered the hall, holding a small boy in his arms. The empress quickly glanced at the boy and immediately noticed clear signs that he was Ray's son. The woman was deeply shocked. To confirm her words, the emperor's former lover took the child in her arms and cried out that this was their son, Edmund. After that, of course, there was an unprecedented uproar in the capital. And this was to be expected, since Regina had announced in front of all the aristocrats that she had a son by the emperor. After this news, the empress's father could not help but visit his daughter, and the maid informed her that the duke was already waiting in the reception room. As soon as she arrived, the duke immediately bowed in greeting. Elia immediately rushed to her father and asked him to get up. On the day the girl decided to get married, her father did not particularly support her. He said that no matter what rumors were spread, he would always wish her happiness. He did not want his daughter to marry only because of him or their family, but she confidently told him that she loved Raymond, although the duke knew that he did not love his daughter. Left alone for a moment, silence reigned. The empress was the first to speak, apologizing to her father for causing him worry. She knew that she had insisted on this marriage, but she also understood that she had never once shown that she was happy in it. Now that the latest news had spread everywhere, she understood that it had broken the duke's heart. Finally, the duke said that his daughter had nothing to apologize for, especially for a situation that she had been unable to resolve. He asked what the emperor had said about all this, and his wife replied that nothing yet. The duke replied that the emperor's decision was important now. His daughter agreed with him and wondered what her husband was thinking. When they returned from the banquet, Raymond did not look at her once, but remained lost in his thoughts. The woman did not know what to say and did not know what would happen to their child. Her father distracted her from her thoughts and said that, as in the past, he only wanted his daughter to be happy. But he was not sure if she could find happiness within the walls of this palace. The Duke regretted that he had not been able to stop the wedding. The Empress thought about this because she herself had never regretted it. She truly loved Raymond, even though she always looked only at his back. However, when his illegitimate son appeared before them, the Emperor did not even think about Ellie. Then she thought that the news of her pregnancy might have cheered her husband up, but now she silently asked her father for forgiveness because she herself did not know what to do. It was late, and the Duke was about to leave. He turned back and told the Empress not to forget that she was still his daughter and could always return to the duchy. The woman was struck by his words. The Duke also warned his daughter that if a conflict arose with the child, he was not sure that the Emperor would take his wife's side. Elia herself understood that this could happen, although she did not want to admit it. Noticing his daughter's sad look, the Duke took her by the hand and simply said that he wanted her to be happy. Late in the evening, sitting in her chambers, the woman could not shake her negative thoughts. But she was interrupted by her maid, who informed her that the Emperor had arrived at the palace. A moment later, he entered the room himself. When the Emperor ordered everyone to leave, the woman noticed the emotions that were raging on her husband's face, but he seemed to have calmed down a little. The Empress invited her husband to the table, but sitting there, the Emperor could not bring himself to say a word. Finally, the Empress said that even if they brought them tea, she had no desire to enjoy it. She kept waiting for her husband to say something because she was sure that he had not come to drink tea with her. Finally, the Empress said that the child Regina had brought could not be ignored. This had happened in front of many people, so it could not be denied. However, before all this, the Emperor wanted to make sure that the boy was of imperial blood, so he asked for information. The woman was afraid of what would happen if the boy turned out to be his relative. Nevertheless, the Emperor did not want to rush and suggested talking later when the results came in, and in the meantime, he suggested that his wife rest somewhere else. He understood that all this could upset the Empress, so he wanted her to collect her thoughts. The woman understood that it sounded as if her husband was worried about her. However, this did not comfort her at all, because she could see from his expression that the Emperor had decided to send her away and was asking her to pretend that she did not understand anything. In this case, she decided that she should also reconsider their relationship. The woman said that she liked the landscape in their southern castle better, and therefore she liked it better too. Her words seemed to pour cold water on the Emperor, but the woman did not let him respond and assured him that everything was fine with her and that they would talk again as soon as the results came in. Several days passed, and the maid burst into the Empress's room and reported that news had arrived from the temple, confirming that the boy was of imperial blood. Elia did not even seem upset by what she heard, as she already understood everything. She replied briefly and sent the maid away. The maid was still standing there, and the woman quietly said that she was tired and wanted to rest, but the maid did not want to leave. For the first time, such behavior angered the Empress, and she scolded the maid, banging her cup on the table. The maid immediately apologized. The woman forgave the maid and said that she was not feeling well today, and therefore would not be able to come to dinner with her husband, and told her to pass this on to the other servants. Left alone, the woman wondered what would happen if the temple confirmed the Emperor's kinship with that child, as soon as everyone would know about it. Raymond currently had no heir, and after the Great Purge, he had no relatives left, so she understood that all eyes would be on that boy. Moreover, he was her husband's first child. Tears rolled down the woman's cheeks at this thought, drowning in tears. The woman silently congratulated her husband, but she couldn't shake the thought that she had wanted to give all this to her child, so she apologized for that. For her, this child was a true miracle, but she understood that it was dangerous to reveal her pregnancy at this time. Of course, there was still a risk of losing the child again, but she also understood that there were people in this palace who were capable of doing something terrible to her unborn child. She also understood that two brothers with different mothers would receive different imperial privileges. Looking out the window and watching the setting sun, the woman asked herself if she would be able to protect her child in all of this. She suddenly thought that the emperor had probably already arrived in the hall for dinner. And if she thought about it, she had never missed a family dinner. She enjoyed ending her day with her husband so much that she came even when she was not feeling well, and Ray had no idea that she was ill. The empress was sure that the emperor would not be thinking about anything today either, but she understood that there was no one to blame for that. On his way to the hall, the emperor noticed that he was running a little late and that his wife was definitely waiting for him. However, upon entering the hall, he immediately noticed that the empress was not at the table. He asked if the empress had not yet arrived, and upon hearing this, one of the servants immediately fell to the floor, apologizing. The servant said that the empress would not be coming today, and that he had forgotten to inform him. The servant was ready to accept punishment, but the emperor only turned away in irritation and ordered everyone to leave. Then the senior servant asked the emperor if he would still be dining in this room. After His Majesty agreed, the servant gave a signal for everything to be prepared. After everyone had left, Raymond sat down to dinner. Glancing at the empty chair where his wife always sat, he wondered why she was not there today. He thought it might be because she was feeling unwell, as she had been very nervous, but then he realized that he had not even thought to ask her why she had not come. The emperor realized that he couldn't taste his food, and suddenly he heard Ellie's voice in his head, asking him how his day had been, which alarmed him. After hearing the voice in his head, the emperor thought that it was because he hadn't been able to sleep well in recent days. However, he also couldn't ignore the thought that his head was preoccupied with Regina bringing the child and the empress's face, which constantly looked as if she was thinking about something. He wondered if Elia was angry with him, even though they hadn't had any arguments before. Ray suddenly realized that he had never seen his wife angry before, so he had no idea what to do now. At the banquet, in honor of Lady Sios's return, he was told that the boy had already suffered a lot of trauma, and it was emphasized that Regina had been there when Raymond was still the emperor's son. His former lover was a flower of high society, and she had raised his status when others pointed fingers at him as the abandoned son of the emperor. For the sake of her family, the girl went to the Western Kingdom. But the emperor quickly rejected the idea because he could not ignore the influence of the heir to the throne and his hatred for him. Nevertheless, risking her life, Regina secretly gave birth to his son, and if he did not accept him, she would take responsibility for the child herself. Although the results had already been announced, he could not respond immediately because he could not get the terrified face of Ellie out of his mind. His wife was hysterical and insisted that the doctor must have said something wrong. But it was the day she lost their child for the first time. With tears in her eyes, she just wanted to know that it was all a lie. Raymond tried to comfort her. However, he couldn't find a single word to say to his wife because he couldn't deny that it was all true. Then Ellie showed her emotions for the first time, and he was afraid that her crying would never stop. And then at the banquet, he couldn't do anything either, just stalling for time. But he realized that his wife had always been on his side, so he was sure that this time would be the same, and she would accept the boy. Calling a servant, the emperor said that he had no appetite, so he ordered everything to be cleared from the table and said that he was going for a short walk. The next day, the maid rushed to the lady as soon as she heard her cough. Approaching her, she noticed that the empress's skin looked unhealthy, so she was worried that something was wrong. Elia got out of bed and assured her that everything was fine. But when she approached the window, she noticed that she had woken up late, and when asked what time it was, she heard that it was already past noon. After that, the empress asked if there was any news from His Majesty. The maid did not know what to say because nothing had come, but the woman was already thinking about it. She asked if the news from the temple had already spread throughout the empire, and after confirmation, she realized that it would no longer be possible to hide anything. She wanted to push all thoughts out of her mind and fall back asleep, but she knew that now was the time to find out Raymond's decision. She understood that only then would she be able to determine the direction of their relationship. Turning away from the window, she told the maid that it was time to visit the emperor. She felt anxious because today she had to make a decision that could affect the rest of her life. Before going to the emperor, she decided to take a walk and remembered that she and Raymond used to walk in this garden. However, this time she was completely alone, but she couldn't help remembering how they had stood here together late in the evening. With every step she took, memories of how they had been here together came flooding back. But she wondered if she was really going there to end their relationship. She didn't know it, but she already guessed what her husband's answer would be, yet she wanted him to announce his decision himself. After that, she was determined to end it all, but she didn't have time to think it through because her tightly clenched fist caught the maid's attention, who thought that the lady's hands were hurting. Elia immediately assured her that this was not the case and said that it just seemed like a very long road to her. The maid did not understand what the empress was getting at, but she continued and said that even if the road seemed long, it would eventually come to an end. However, as soon as she entered the office, the servant at the entrance immediately informed her that the emperor was not there. This surprised the empress. The woman tried to find out where His Majesty had gone, but the servant could not find the words or the strength to tell her. However, from the servant's expression, the empress immediately guessed that the emperor was with Regina. Finally, the empress asked one last question: where was the emperor now? The servant gathered his strength and said that His Majesty was in the flower garden. The woman was somewhat surprised because her former lover was also there. Only members of the imperial family were allowed to enter the flower garden. However, she was most disturbed by the thought that behind the flower garden was a small garden that she herself tended, and now her rival was there with her child. Unable to bear it any longer, the woman ran to the flower garden, but as soon as she reached the entrance, she heard her husband's voice and the laughter of a child and stopped. Immediately after that, she saw her husband smiling warmly at the boy, holding him in his arms with Regina walking slowly behind them. While she was watching this scene, the maid approached her and whispered that she would not tell the emperor. The empress replied that even without seeing her husband, she clearly understood what his answer would be. She now understood for sure that this was how it would be because even at the wedding, Raymond had said that he could not promise her love. And yet she had married him, knowing where his heart lay. And yet Elia thought that if she tried hard enough, her husband would at least look at her once. But now she understood that all her efforts were in vain. For a moment she met Regina's gaze and saw complete confidence in her eyes. It seemed that her rival wanted to show her where her place was and where the empress's place was. Without saying another word, the woman turned away, accepting reality and shunning herself. If she had understood and accepted this earlier, if she had not felt Ray's warmth, it would not have been so painful now. Tears fell from her eyes in small drops, and she told the maid that it was time to go. At the last moment, she still felt a joy that was mixed with the pain in her chest. Leaving the flower garden, the woman finally made up her mind. She would no longer live in the past and would not stay behind her husband. After that, Regina apologized to the emperor for coming to the flower garden, knowing that only the imperial family was allowed there, but Ray assured her that it was no big deal. Lady Sios arrived with her son and suddenly asked for an audience, hiding behind the child and saying that she would wait until the end, so the emperor had no choice but to receive her. But on the way back, Edmund ran toward the garden because he saw strange wild flowers and threw a tantrum, wanting to go there, so they had to let him go. However, the most important thing was that the boy could fall again, but the woman just smiled and said that, as before, the emperor could simply catch the child. Raymond looked at his former lover, and remembering the banquet where he first met her after a long separation, was surprised at himself that he could only consider her a part of his past. She turned around and they met, but his heart did not react. There were no feelings, as if he had simply met a person from his past. What's more, even when he saw her, it wasn't Regina who concerned him most, but Elia. Lady Sios' voice distracted him from his thoughts. The woman asked what the emperor was thinking so deeply about, and was about to touch his hand. However, His Majesty quickly withdrew his hand and even pushed the woman away. Even Raymond himself was surprised by this reflexive movement. He quickly apologized to the lady for his action, but the woman, in her usual manner, only smiled broadly. After that, the emperor looked at the boy who was still running around the flower garden and jumping happily. Finally, His Majesty said that he would accept the boy into the imperial family. The woman was shocked and fell silent for a moment, but then quickly bowed and thanked him. However, the emperor had not finished and said that for this to happen, Regina would have to give up her son. The lady was speechless, but Raymond said that he would adopt the boy. From that moment on, he would become the son of the empress. The woman looked at him in confusion, and the emperor said that this was the only way for the boy to become a member of the imperial family. There was a strict rule of monogamy in the empire, although the Marquise of Sios continued to urge the emperor to divorce Elia. However, The emperor gave his word that this would never happen. He turned to his former wife again, noticing her anxiety, and assumed that she was not ready to part with her son. Looking at her son, the lady assured him that she had always wanted him to be happy, so if this was the only option, she was ready to accept the emperor's will. Raymond did not respond, and only said that he would inform the lady as soon as he had discussed it with the empress. With that, the emperor turned away, as he had other matters to attend to. The lady remained in the flower garden for some time, watching His Majesty leave. Elia could not even remember how she returned to her chambers. She immediately fell onto the bed and began to cry bitterly. She began to understand that she had lived in her husband's shadow for too long. When she was behind him, she never wished for happiness for herself. That is why she could easily let him go. However, she could not understand why Raymond, having given her happiness, was now taking it away so cruelly. The emperor could not promise her love, but he promised to save her from loneliness. Yet now she saw that he had not kept that promise either. He had severed even the tiny thread of warm feelings that had bound them together before she had miscarried. Although she continued to smile every day, inside she felt as if everything had dried up. Her soul was withering away without nourishment, and if it weren't for this child, who was like a miracle, she would have dried up and died. She was very angry with Ray. Evening came, and the woman, feeling the western rays of the sun on her face, quickly got up, realizing that it was almost time for dinner. However, in a moment, she laughed at herself, because habit was a nasty thing. Crying again, the woman realized that now she didn't need to go to dinner with her husband. Now she had to slowly get rid of all the habits related to the emperor. The woman promised herself that even though it would not be easy, she would get rid of all her habits one by one. Suddenly, Elia felt a sharp pain in her stomach and it twisted her. She couldn't understand why it suddenly hurt so much, but she remembered the doctor's words that she mustn't get nervous. The woman thought that something might have happened to the child. She barely managed to reach the bell, and the maid came running at her call. The maid saw her mistress writhing in pain. The maid rushed to the empress and, realizing that something was wrong, shouted for someone to call the doctor immediately. Barely holding back the pain, the empress stopped the maid and said that the imperial doctor should not be called. The maid did not understand this and was very worried because she saw that her mistress had turned pale. Elia, in turn, told the maid to send an urgent message to the Duchy of Croft. The empress wanted a doctor to be sent from there because it was already late and the imperial physician was no longer available, and the duchy was not far away. The maid wanted to object, but after her mistress was again overcome by pain, she quickly agreed and said she would send the message immediately. After giving her orders, the maid returned to the empress's room and helped her into bed, but noticed that she was covered in cold sweat. Lying in bed, the empress begged that everything would be all right with the child, for she could not bear to lose her again. After a while, a servant entered the room and announced that the carriage from the duchy had arrived. The maid ordered the door to be opened immediately. Almost immediately, the Duke burst into the room, followed by his doctor. Croft ordered the doctor to examine the empress immediately. The woman said that she would like to be examined in silence, so she asked everyone to leave. The maid wanted to object, but the lady made it clear that it was an order. The Duke remained behind, worried about his daughter, and said that it would be better to call the imperial physician, but the empress said that this could not be done. A moment later, the empress revealed the reason. She told her father that she was pregnant, and this news stunned the Duke. However, the empress emphasized that she did not want the emperor to find out about this, because she was planning to leave him in the near future. At that moment, the servant, trembling with fear, informed the emperor that the empress would not be coming to dinner today. Ray was surprised. He could not understand why the empress was absent again today. The emperor immediately asked if there was any other news from the empress's palace, but the servant assured him that there was nothing else. The emperor looked angrily at the servant, saying that something must have happened to the empress. The servant looked back and trembled again, but said he had heard nothing else. However, the servant was forced to report that the empress had come to His Majesty during the day, but had left when she did not find the emperor. The emperor asked what time it was, and the servant replied that the empress had come when His Majesty was with Regina. This stunned him. After hearing this, the emperor felt uneasy. An elderly servant approached him and asked if the emperor would like to have dinner, but His Majesty refused. The servant said that he was worried about the emperor. that he might fall ill, since he had not even been able to eat properly. But the man assured him that this was not enough to make him weak. The servant then asked if the emperor would like to retire to his chambers. The man thought for a moment and looked out the window where he could see the empress's palace and said that he would go visit his wife. Quickly gathering his belongings, the emperor, accompanied by his knights, headed for the empress's palace. Before entering his wife's palace, he noticed a carriage with the Croft coat of arms. This greatly surprised the emperor. Calmly, His Majesty asked if the reason the empress had not come to dinner today was because the duke had visited her. The servant simply suggested that they return. The emperor refused and said that in that case he would also greet the duke, but before the palace doors could be opened, the duke himself was already waiting at the entrance. The duke did not let the emperor pass and said that he could not go through. One of the knights almost rushed at the duke with his sword because of such insolence, but His Majesty stopped him. However, a moment later the emperor himself asked whether the duke was really blocking his way. Croft replied that the empress was not feeling well, so it would be better for the emperor to return to his quarters. The emperor replied that if the empress was not feeling well, that was the reason he had come to see her, as he was her husband. These words stunned the duke, but after calming down a little, the man looked away, as if to indicate that he did not agree with this. Noticing the duke's reaction, the emperor asked if he thought the duke was dissatisfied with him, and Croft replied that the emperor was mistaken. The emperor did not expect such an answer, and the duke, looking angrily at His Majesty, said that the empress was not feeling well, and that the reason for this was her husband. The emperor, in turn, did not understand what the duke was getting at, and the man explained that rumours about Regina bringing a child had already spread throughout the empire, and this had affected the empress. Hearing this, Raymond was shocked, because he really could not imagine that nothing would happen to the empress, and that everything would go smoothly. The duke continued and said that when the emperor wanted to marry his daughter, he promised that he would make her happy no matter what. In reality, Croft knew that the emperor did not love Elia, but he had made this promise in order to secure the marriage. Now Ray understood that he did not truly love his wife, but he had not expected that this would affect her happiness in any way, because he believed that happiness did not always come from love. The duke shouted at the emperor and asked him if he still kept the promise he had once made to His Majesty. The emperor himself was shocked by this question, because he did not know what to say. He knew very well that after some time he himself had deliberately stopped looking at his wife. The reason was that as soon as he looked at her, his heart would tighten for some reason. Because of this, the emperor did not know if his wife was happy. In addition, the duke's eyes were the same purple colour as his wife's, which made his heart tighten again. At this point, Croft again asked the emperor to return to his palace. The emperor no longer argued and only asked the duke to let him know immediately when the empress was feeling better. A servant had been standing quietly behind the wall the whole time, and as soon as the emperor left, she rushed to the duke and told him with a smile that the empress's condition had stabilized. In the empress's chambers, the doctor asked if the lady was no longer in pain. The woman confirmed this, but she was most concerned about the condition of the child. The doctor assured her that the child was fine and that it was probably just a little fear caused by stress. The empress breathed a sigh of relief. A moment later, the duke burst into the room and asked if his daughter was all right. Elia smiled and replied that she was fine, as was the baby. The duke breathed a sigh of relief and sat down next to his daughter's bed. The empress asked where her husband had gone. The man replied that his daughter had received a letter, so he had stepped out for a moment. Croft immediately asked the doctor if the empress was really all right. The doctor assured him that Her Majesty and the child were out of danger for now. However, the doctor also emphasized that from now on, it was necessary to closely monitor the lady's health and ensure a stress-free environment. The duke understood everything and asked the doctor to leave for a moment. When the empress was left alone with her father, she thought that her news about the child had been too sudden, so her father had not even had time to rejoice. The duke apologized to his daughter, although she did not understand what he was apologizing for, but the duke continued and said that after her mother's death, he had promised himself to make his daughter the happiest woman in the world. However, the man was saddened because he had not been able to keep his promise. The empress immediately rushed to him and assured him that it was not her father's fault, as it had all been her choice. The woman paused for a moment, then said that she no longer had any regrets or worries, so she wanted to leave Raymond and live happily with her child. The Duke was surprised at first, but after a moment he smiled and promised his daughter that she should not worry about anything, and that he would do everything to ensure that the Emperor never found out about the child. The father wanted his daughter to take care of herself first, and he would send the divorce papers to the Imperial Palace first thing tomorrow. However, the Empress objected and said that she would do everything herself so that she would have no regrets. The Duke began to worry whether everything would really be all right with his daughter. The Empress assured him that everything would be fine, because she no longer expected anything from her husband. Besides, she had someone more important in her life. Her father did not argue, but emphasized that if the Emperor did not want to divorce so easily, he would intervene. Elia thought about it, because she understood that her father's words about a difficult divorce could be true, because at that time, she was the daughter of one of the two duchies. However, the second duchy had lost almost all its power, so only its name remained. It could be considered that only one duchy remained in the empire, Crofton. On top of that, she was the daughter of a conquering duke. Knowing Raymond's point of view, the woman was sure that it would not be easy for him to give her up. Of course, it was a little hurtful that the reason for such difficulties was her origin, but now she understood that it no longer bothered her. The Empress agreed that her father could intervene if necessary. The Duke agreed and told his daughter not to think about anything else today and to go to bed. After that, the Duke got up and said that it was time for him to leave. His daughter apologized for not being able to see him off. Left alone, the Empress mentally prepared herself for the next day's conversation. The next morning, as soon as the Empress woke up, her maid immediately approached her and asked how she was feeling. The woman assured her that everything was fine and that it was all the result of feeling unwell. The Empress assured her that there was nothing to worry about. Rejoicing at this news, the maid said she would prepare everything for washing, and Elia also asked her to prepare a dress. She said she would like to visit the Emperor right away, but this made the maid a little nervous. The woman asked what was the matter, and the maid replied that she was worried because the lady had been unwell recently. The Empress asked if that was the only problem. The maid bowed and assured her that it was the only thing. Elia wondered for a moment if she had reacted too harshly. The maids quickly helped the Empress get ready, and the woman was almost ready to leave. There was only one detail left, her jewelry, and the maid showed her the sapphire earrings. The Empress remembered that these earrings had been given to her just before her wedding, and she valued them greatly. However, she now refused to wear them and thought that all the precious stones she had were gifts, so she would have to leave them here in the palace when she left. She was about to leave when there was a sudden knock at the door, and the maid announced that the Emperor himself had arrived at her palace. The Empress was very surprised by this, because it had never happened before that the Emperor had come to her palace so early in the morning. The woman immediately ordered him to be brought in, and when the Emperor entered, she immediately bowed in reverence. Ray rushed to her to help his wife up. However, the Empress immediately turned away from his outstretched hand and did not want to look her husband in the eyes. The Emperor was very surprised by her reaction. Elia asked him why he'd come, but the Emperor did not answer right away. He just squeezed her hand. The woman thought that he was angry because she had not accepted his hand. Looking closely at her husband, she realized that he was not angry, but noticed that his gaze was pensive. And now she was angry because he had never looked at her like that before. The Emperor had never paid so much attention to her before that she felt any complex emotions. At that, the Emperor ordered everyone to leave the room. As soon as they were alone, the Empress noticed again that her husband's gaze had returned to normal, so she thought that she had imagined it all. Finally, the Emperor said that he wanted to talk. The Empress said that she also wanted to say something, and her husband let her speak first and said that he had a question about Edmund. Elia was not at all surprised that all his questions were about Regina. The woman remembered that they had wanted to talk about this when confirmation came from the temple, so now she was interested in her husband's opinion. The Emperor thought for a moment. Finally, he said that he was very guilty towards his wife, but since the temple had confirmed that the boy was of imperial blood, he could not grow up anywhere, because Ray himself knew what it was like to grow up in such conditions. The woman was moved by the Emperor's words for a moment, because she understood that her husband probably saw himself in the boy. But she quickly came to her senses, because it no longer bothered her, so she asked him again about his decision. The emperor immediately replied that he intended to recognize the boy as a member of the imperial family and make him the first heir. The empress was not at all surprised by what she heard. In fact, since morning, the woman had been wondering if she would feel any regret after her decision. But looking at her husband now, she understood that she definitely would not. For a moment, Elia just smiled to herself and replied that if that was what the emperor wanted, he could make Edmund his heir. Hearing this, Ray also smiled and was about to thank his wife. However, a moment later, she said that in return, she wanted her husband to do something. The emperor replied without hesitation that he would do anything. The woman smiled so that it would be so. For a moment, the woman thought that she had always wanted her husband to look at her with his own eyes. But in all her life, this was the first time he had looked at her directly. In a cold tone, the empress said that she wanted to divorce him. These words brought Raymond down to earth. Elia saw her husband's excitement for the first time, and for some reason it made her feel better. The woman said aloud that she wanted to leave this place. The emperor was only angered by her words and said that it was nonsense, and that if she did not want to accept Edmund, she should have said so. Earlier, the empress would have been alarmed by this angry look, but now she felt completely calm. The empress explained that the boy was his son, and even if she was against it, Edmund would eventually become emperor. But that was not the reason she wanted a divorce. Still barely holding back his anger, the emperor asked what the real reason was. The empress said that from the very beginning, she had decided to marry him out of love. The empress still did not understand why his wife was only telling him this now, and reminded her that even the boy would not change anything, and that there would be no other lady in the palace except her. At this, Elia exclaimed that she no longer felt any love for her husband. These words unexpectedly struck the emperor. Raymond considered her words nonsense, because they were not just husband and wife, but emperor and empress, so he exclaimed, confident that it was all because of Regina. Hearing that all her feelings for her husband were foolish, the woman looked at him in surprise, then asked if Ray really thought there were no problems in their relationship. The emperor could not answer this question, but he understood that the recent events had come as a surprise to his wife. Yet they could not divorce. The empress wanted to say something, but her husband abruptly stood up and called for his servants. A moment later, the senior servant entered the room. His Majesty ordered him to immediately inform the knights to surround the empress's palace, and that from that moment on, anyone who entered or left the palace must obtain his permission. Glancing at his wife one last time, the emperor also forbade the empress from leaving the palace. Elia rushed to her husband, but he paid no attention to her and walked away. The empress managed to grab her husband by the hem of his robe, but he immediately pushed her away. After the emperor left her chambers, a maid rushed up to her, concerned that the lady was all right. The empress came to her senses, rubbing her injured hand. The maid was no less shocked by the events, as her mistress had been restricted. Elia understood that getting a divorce would not be easy, but she did not expect such a strong reaction. Without commenting on her situation, the empress only said that there was something the maids needed to do before the knights arrived. The maid was ready to help. Sitting down at the table, she quickly wrote a letter. The woman felt sorry that she had to ask her father for help, because she wanted to resolve everything peacefully. When she finished, the empress handed the envelope to the maid and ordered her to send it immediately to the Duchy of Croft. When the maid left to carry out the order, Elia looked out the window and saw her husband accompanied by knights. He was walking toward his palace. She hoped there would not be much commotion. Late into the evening, Raymond sat in his study, thinking about what had happened that day, but his wife's words about divorce only angered him again. The empress's words replayed over and over in his head, and unable to contain his anger any longer, the emperor slammed his fist on the table. A servant entered the office and asked him to calm down. After the servant's words, the emperor forced himself to exhale, but the feeling of unease in his soul would not go away. No matter how hard he tried, everything inside him was burning, and he did not understand what he was so angry about. The emperor assumed that it was because of his wife's words about divorce, but he couldn't accept that he was angry just because of that, and was sure that there was something else. However, the emperor still had no feelings for Ellie that would break his heart like this, so he thought that he should not be so angry at her words about divorce, but think about everything logically. However, when he heard those meaningless words about love, Something inside him turned upside down. A servant distracted the emperor from his thoughts and informed him that he had brought tea to calm his majesty's feelings, but Raymond refused. The servant did not insist, but decided to ask the emperor if he had really decided to lock the empress in her palace. The emperor asked him to repeat that. Remembering his last words about his wife, he was disappointed because they had been about the knights. But it turned out as if he had locked the empress in her own palace. The servant, in turn, decided to share his thoughts on the matter and said that if the empress was locked up, not only the aristocrats but also the common people would begin to worry. The servant then asked the emperor to reverse his decision. Raymond thought about it because if he decided to release his wife, she would immediately leave the palace. A moment later, there was a knock at the door, and one of the knights entered with the emperor's permission to report something. The emperor asked if it concerned the empress's palace, and the knight immediately handed him a letter and reported that they had intercepted a servant with it who was trying to leave the palace through a secret passage. The letter was handed to the emperor, who read it immediately and was shocked when he realized that the empress was asking her father for help. As soon as he finished reading, the emperor stood up and silently burned the letter. Immediately afterwards, he gave orders that, from now on, every maid leaving the empress's palace should be checked particularly carefully. They were not allowed to take anything out without his knowledge. After that, the emperor ordered that the chancellor be informed that Duke Croft had been appointed head of the delegation to the eastern country. The duke was to be sent off the very next day. After that, the emperor turned to his servant again and ordered him to make sure that rumours about the empress did not leave the palace walls and that the servants kept their mouths shut. After everyone had left to carry out the orders, the emperor remained disappointed, staring at the remains of the letter on his desk. Raymond couldn't get rid of the thought of how his wife could have done this to him. She had always been within arm's reach. Looking out the window at the empress's palace, the man was sure that all these events had happened because of Edmund. But he thought that these were temporary difficulties and that everything would calm down over time. Since their conversation, the empress had not left her chambers. The woman sat on the bed, but sleep would not come, even though it was late at night. The maid offered to bring the lady some tea, but the empress refused and allowed the servant to go to bed. But Helen could not leave her mistress while she was in such a state. The maid advised her to go to bed and talk to the emperor again tomorrow. The woman thought about everything. She already knew that her message had not left the palace. Moreover, the knights had surrounded her palace so tightly that even a fly could not get through. The woman would never have thought that Ray was capable of such a thing. She thought that this decision was made out of anger. However, the knights did not leave her palace, and according to the maid who had her letter, an order of silence had been issued so that the situation in the palace would not reach the ears of others. Moreover, she already knew that her father had been sent to an eastern country, and was sure that this was done to prevent her from leaving the palace. The empress was immediately overcome with anxiety about this, because with time it would become more and more difficult to hide her pregnancy, and the quarrel between the emperor and the duke could end badly for both of them. Helen distracted her from her gloomy thoughts. The maid noticed that the lady was not looking well again, and was worried that something might happen to her. Elia understood that the maid's words were true and could not allow herself to faint again, so she asked the maid to bring her some tea. Calming down, the woman hugged her stomach and promised herself that everything would work out fine. The next morning, the emperor was already sitting at his desk, sorting through documents. While he was reading letters, he called a servant and asked about the empress's condition. The servant reported that no changes had been noticed and that the empress had had a good breakfast, and after breakfast had gone for a walk in the garden, as she usually did. The emperor was unpleasantly surprised by this news. After her words about divorce, he had been unable to sleep or eat properly, but Elia was behaving as usual. He couldn't believe that divorce was such a trivial matter for the empress. Lost in thought, Ray didn't even notice that he had clenched his hand so tightly that the pen broke and cut his hand. The servant rushed to the emperor in alarm as soon as he saw the blood and was about to call a doctor, but the emperor assured him that it was not necessary. The emperor rubbed the affected area, and it seemed as if only this wound could bring His Majesty back to his senses so that he would not be able to sink into his thoughts again. A moment later, the emperor was informed that Duke Croft was requesting an audience. Raymond wondered why he had come, as he did not think that rumours about the empress could have spread in just one day. The emperor decided that the duke's arrival must have something to do with the delegation to the Eastern Empire. Of course, he did not want to meet with the duke at that moment, but there was no reason to refuse him. As soon as the emperor gave the duke permission to enter, the man immediately found himself in His Majesty's office and bowed in greeting. The duke approached the emperor's desk and, without a word, handed him an envelope. The emperor immediately asked what it contained, and the duke replied that he was officially requesting a divorce on behalf of the entire duchy. Raymond understood that the duke could not have found out what had happened in the empress's palace in one day, so he assumed that he had arranged everything with his daughter beforehand. Croft, in turn, asked about his daughter. The emperor did not answer this question, and the duke asked again more insistently where the empress was. The emperor asked if the duke thought he had locked her in the basement. The duke did not take this joke well and shouted loudly at His Majesty, attracting the attention and alarm of the knights who were guarding him. However, the emperor stopped the knights and a moment later ordered everyone to leave the office. Left alone with the duke, the emperor asked if he really thought he had treated his daughter so badly. Croft apologized for his harsh tone. After that, the emperor said that he would cancel the duke's delegation if he took the divorce papers with him. However, the duke had no intention of backing down and said that he could not do so. Enraged, the emperor slammed his fist on the table and shouted at the duke, but he quickly calmed down when he saw the calm look on his guest's face. In turn, the duke said that there were already enough reasons to ask for a divorce and that he only wanted everything to go peacefully. The marriage contract, which the emperor himself had drawn up, stated that if one of the spouses brought a lover or an illegitimate child without the knowledge of the other, this would be sufficient grounds for divorce. Now His Majesty understood that because of Edmund, divorce was inevitable. The emperor then realized that he had fallen into the trap he had set himself. Realizing this, the emperor tried to explain everything and said that he had no intention of making the boy the heir to the throne. The duke did not expect to hear such words from His Majesty. Although he understood that getting a divorce would not be easy, he did not expect Raymond to give up the boy so easily. Nevertheless, the duke could not back down and said that it was not only because of Edmund. The emperor was surprised by what he heard. He understood that things had not gone as they should have from the very beginning with his wife, but he had no idea what else could have gone wrong. His Majesty could not even guess what else could be the reason, if not his son, and was sure that everything was fine in his relationship with the empress. The duke had nothing to say in response and only said that if the emperor really thought so, then the conversation could be over. The emperor quickly realized that he would not be able to learn anything more from the old duke, so he gave in and allowed him to leave. Left alone, the emperor thought again about divorce, but it seemed that he had already accepted the idea. He did not want to quarrel with such a distinguished duke, so it was better to accept his terms. It seemed that the decision had already been made, but the emperor did not feel any better and was still hesitant. After her walk, the empress returned to her chambers and did not leave them until evening, when her maid returned. The woman asked if Helen had found out anything. The maid told her that Duke Croft had come to see the emperor that afternoon and asked for an audience. The empress immediately asked what the atmosphere had been like. The maid could not say exactly what had happened between them, but she had heard that the two had been arguing loudly. The lady was upset by what she had heard. The empress understood well that if rumours about this, as well as about her being locked in the palace, spread outside the palace, it would certainly not bring anything good to either the emperor or the duke. At that point, Elia decided that she had to end it all before that happened. So she told her maid to tell the knights guarding the entrance that she was inviting the emperor to dinner. Helen immediately obeyed the order, while the empress looked out the window again. The woman knew that she did not really want to see the emperor, but she wanted to end it all. Elia knew very well that the emperor had always looked down on her, but her love for him was as great as his arrogance. Summoning all her determination, the empress turned around and went to meet the emperor, because it was her feelings that made her dare to do so. When she came to the emperor, she immediately bowed. The man was already waiting for her at the table, so he invited his wife to join him. The woman sat down in her usual place without protest, but she felt uncomfortable returning there. However, after a moment, she looked resolutely at her husband. The emperor ordered everyone to leave the room and, remaining alone with his wife, said that he had not expected her to ask to see him first. The empress said that it was because she had changed her mind. Hearing this, the emperor breathed a sigh of relief and told her not to bring up the subject of divorce again. The lady lowered her head sadly and, looking at the plate full of food, thought that she wanted to say this as soon as their last supper was over. Looking at her husband again, she said that her change of heart did not mean that she did not want to divorce him. The lady said that she had come today to end everything once and for all. After her words, the emperor slammed his fist on the table and said that he would not divorce her. But Elia did not react to his anger and only replied that she had already made up her mind and did not want to argue. The man shouted that they were in no position to divorce just because their feelings had changed. She replied that she understood this well and took the blame upon herself, for she had been so naive as to see him not as an emperor, but as a boy named Raymond. After a moment of warm memories, the woman finally asked her husband to let her go because she didn't want to be alone anymore. The emperor told her to stop talking nonsense about love and acting like a fool. The lady was shocked by what she heard and, looking at her husband, thought that she had given up everything just for this.